Some truths cut deeper than a blade, and in the dusty heart of Willow Creek, New Mexico, one girl's whisper was about to shatter a town's silence. Emma, barely 19, carried a pain no one dared to see, hidden beneath her worn dress and quiet steps. The town turned away, blind to her bruises, deaf to her flinches. All but one man. A loner, a blacksmith haunted by his own ghosts. He saw her. And what he did next would change everything. If stories like this speak to you, hit the like button and subscribe. There's more to come. The morning sun hung low over Willow Creek, painting the adobe houses in shades of faded gold. Emma stood in the courtyard of the old chapel, her arms trembling under the weight of iron pots. She moved carefully, each step measured, like someone afraid of breaking something inside herself. Her dark hair clung to her sweat, damp forehead, and her hands, rough from scrubbing, bore faint scars that told stories she never spoke aloud. At 19, she should have been dreaming of a future, maybe a family, or at least a life beyond the chapel's shadow. Instead, she lived in a world of hushed endurance, serving the household of Reverend Thomas Blake, the man who'd taken her in after her parents died in a fever years ago. Taken her in, yes, but not out of kindness. Inside the chapel's kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of cornbread and judgment. The women, wives of deacons and farmers, bustled around, their voices sharp with gossip. Reverend Blake's wife, Margaret, stood at the center, her apron crisp, her eyes colder than the stone floor. "Get those pots scrubbed, Emma," she snapped, not looking up from her dough. Emma nodded, silent, and knelt by the stove to stack firewood. Her knees pressed into the floor, and a sharp wince escaped her lips. It was small, barely a breath, but it hung in the air like a crack in glass. One of the women, Sister Ellen, paused, her knife hovering over a loaf. "What's got you moving like an old mule, girl?" she asked, her tone more curious than kind. Emma stood slowly, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "It hurts when I sit," she whispered. The words were so soft they might have dissolved into the heat of the room. For a moment, everything stopped. The clatter of pans, the hum of voices, all gone. Then Sister Ellen chuckled, tight and dismissive. "Well, maybe sit up straighter then," she said, and turned back to her bread. The other women followed her lead, their chatter resuming like nothing had happened. No one asked what Emma meant. No one wanted to know. She slipped out to the chapel steps, where she could scrub stone in peace, away from their eyes. The hem of her dress was soaked, her wrists raw from the lye. She sat for just a second on the edge of a step, but the moment her hips touched the stone, her whole body flinched. A small gasp slipped out, and she bit her lip to keep from crying. Across the street, under the sagging awning of the blacksmith's shop, a man watched. Jacob Kane, the town called him. A drifter turned loner, a man whose words had dried up the day his wife and daughter were buried. His broad shoulders leaned against a post, his face weathered by years of sun and sorrow. Gray streaked his beard, and his eyes, dark and steady, seemed to see through things rather than at them. He'd been forging horseshoes when he noticed Emma, not because she was loud, but because she was too quiet. The way she moved, careful and guarded, stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt since his daughter's fever took her. Emma met his gaze for a fleeting moment, then stood, brushed her skirt, and vanished around the corner. That evening, the chapel glowed with candlelight as the town gathered for service. Emma sat alone in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The pews, worn smooth by years of worship, should have been a comfort, but when she lowered herself onto the wood, a sharp breath escaped her. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A few heads turned. Reverend Blake, mid-sermon, paused, then flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised his voice, drowning her sound in a tide of scripture. Emma stared at her hands, where faint marks crisscrossed her knuckles like old burns. She glanced toward the door, and there, just outside, she saw him. Jacob, leaning against the hitching rail, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows in the dusk. He didn't come inside, but he didn't leave either. The town sang hymns, their voices rising in harmony. Outside, one man stood still, seeing what no one else would. Reverend Thomas Blake was a pillar in Willow Creek, a man whose sermons could make the devil weep. He'd baptized every child, buried every elder, and married every blushing bride for 20 years. To the town, he was God's voice, unwavering and true. But to Emma, he was something else. She lived in a cramped room at the back of his house, a space with a cot, a rusted basin, and no warmth. The Reverend called it charity, but there was no mercy in the way he watched her, no kindness in the way Margaret corrected her with a ladle's edge. That night, after service, Emma returned to the Blake house alone. The Reverend stayed behind, meeting with the church board, or so he said. Margaret sat in the kitchen, stitching a hymn book cover, her needle moving with precision. You shamed us tonight, she said, her voice low, gasping in church like some wounded animal. Emma stood silent, her hands still smelling of wax. Learn to sit still, Margaret went on. Pain is part of obedience. Emma didn't answer. Go to your room, Margaret said. Scrub the chapel steps before dawn. Maybe kneeling will teach you your place. Emma climbed the narrow stairs, each step a reminder of the ache in her thighs. In her room, she curled against the wall, clutching a thin blanket. A single star blinked through a crack in the roof. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She just stayed awake, listening to the house settle. Miles away, Jacob sat on his porch, polishing a horseshoe by the glow of a dying fire. His hands, rough from years at the forge, moved slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Emma's flinch, her whispered words. It hurts when I sit. He looked toward the chapel, as if the wind might carry answers. Something was wrong in Willow Creek, and for the first time in years, he couldn't look away. Jacob Kane hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in years, not since the cedar tree on Ridgeback Hill became his daughter's resting place. His voice had gone silent with her, buried in the dirt alongside the wildflowers she used to leave on his anvil. But now, at 42, with calloused hands and a heart heavy from carrying ghosts, he found himself watching a girl who moved like she was hiding something broken. Emma's quiet pain wasn't loud, but to Jacob, it was deafening. He saw it in the way she flinched, the way her eyes darted when someone stepped too close. It wasn't just the bruises on her wrists or the careful way she sat. It was the weight of a truth no one else in Willow Creek dared to touch. Each morning, Jacob rose before dawn, coaxing fire from the coals in his forge. The rhythm of hammer on iron was his language now, steady and unyielding. But that day, as the first light crept over the hills, his mind wasn't on the horseshoes or the nails he'd promised the miller. He kept seeing Emma, kneeling on the chapel steps, scrubbing stone until her hands bled. He'd seen pain like hers before, not just in his daughter Sarah, but in the women who'd come to the army camps years ago, their eyes hollow, their voices gone. Women who'd learned to flinch before a hand was even raised. He'd been too late to help them, too late to save Sarah from the fever. But Emma was still here, still breathing, and that stirred something in him, an old, rusted instinct to protect. By mid-morning, Jacob hitched his mule to the cart and rode into town. Willow Creek was already awake, the streets buzzing with the clatter of barrels and the laughter of children chasing stray dogs. Emma was there, still at the chapel steps, her dress soaked at the knees, her hands pink and raw. She didn't look up as the townsfolk passed, didn't pause when Reverend Blake strolled by, his hands clasped behind his back. Obedience is a blessing, child, he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. Emma nodded, her brush scraping harder against the stone. Jacob watched from across the street, his hand resting on the cart's worn strap. Their eyes met just for a moment. Hers were tired, guarded, like a deer sensing a hunter. His were steady, unreadable. She looked away first. Inside the general store, Jacob bought a coil of rope and a sack of nails. The shopkeeper, a wiry man named Amos, grinned. Fixing a fence cane. Jacob dropped 2 silver coins on the counter and left without a word. He wasn't building a fence. He wasn't sure what he was building, only that something had to change. That evening, as the sky turned to ash, he sat on his porch, the rope coiled beside him, an old hunting knife in his lap. His thumb traced the blade's edge, not cutting, just remembering. He thought of Sarah, her soft laugh, her tiny hand in his. He thought of his wife Ellen, bleeding out on a winter night, her breath slipping away before he could call her back. And he thought of Emma, her whispered confession echoing like a bell he couldn't unhear. It hurts when I sit. Back in town, Emma sat in her attic room, her body curled tight against the wall. The ache in her bones was a constant companion, a dull fire that never went out. She stared at the ceiling, where a single nail hung loose in the beam, a spider weaving its web around it. Her hands, wrapped in scraps of linen, trembled as she clutched her blanket. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. But her mind raced. She'd seen Jacob watching her, not like the others, not with pity or judgment. His eyes held something else, something that scared her as much as it comforted her. Hope, the kind that could break you if it didn't hold. Downstairs, Margaret Blake's voice cut through the silence. You're slow tonight, girl. Don't think I didn't notice. Emma didn't answer. She never did. Margaret stepped closer, her shadow filling the doorway. You think anyone cares about your little size? You're here because we allow it. Remember that. Emma stayed still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. When Margaret left, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. Emma's thoughts drifted to Jacob, to the way he'd stood outside the chapel, unmoving, like a man waiting for a storm. She didn't know why he cared, but she felt it, and that feeling was dangerous. It made her want to speak, to run, to do something other than survive. The next morning, Jacob walked into Willow Creek earlier than usual. The air was heavy, the sky the color of old paper. He found Emma at the chapel's water pump, filling a bucket with shaking hands. Her knuckles were bandaged, and a faint bruise shadowed one eye, barely hidden by a dusting of powder. She froze when she saw him, the bucket nearly slipping from her grip. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, rough from dessous. Emma didn't meet his eyes. She turned to walk away, her steps quick. Jacob followed, just a pace behind. "You don't have to stay quiet," he said. She stopped, her back to him. "That's what they told the last girl," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Then she kept walking, disappearing into the chapel's shadow. Jacob stood there, her words sinking into him like a blade. The last girl. He didn't know who she was, but he knew what it meant. He'd heard whispers in town before, stories of girls who'd worked for the Blakes, girls who'd left suddenly, their names forgotten. He turned and headed for the sheriff's office, his boots heavy on the boardwalk. Sheriff Daniel Holt was lounging in his chair, a toothpick in his mouth, a rifle across his lap. He looked up with a lazy grin. "Jacob Kane in town twice in a week. Must be trouble brewing." Jacob didn't waste words. "The girl at the chapel's hurt." Holt raised an eyebrow. "Emma." "The Blakes' ward." "She's fine. She'd tell you otherwise. She didn't have to," Jacob said. Holt leaned forward, his grin fading. "You're stirring a hornet's nest, Kane. The Blakes are good people. Without proof. You're just a man talking nonsense." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He left, the sheriff's warning ringing in his ears. "Keep the peace," Holt had said, but peace built on silence wasn't peace at all. That night, Emma lay in her attic room, the darkness pressing against her. She whispered into the void, her voice so soft it barely reached her own ears. "Please don't stop seeing me." She didn't know if she was speaking to Jacob, to God, or to herself. All she knew was that for the first time in years, someone had noticed her pain, and that small spark of hope was enough to keep her awake, trembling, waiting for what came next. The sun climbed higher over Willow Creek, but its warmth did little to lift the weight hanging over the town. Jacob Kane's footsteps echoed on the boardwalk, each one heavier than the last, as he walked away from the sheriff's office. His confrontation with Sheriff Holt had left him empty-handed. The man's words, "Keep the peace," ringing hollow in his ears. Peace, Jacob thought, was just another word for turning a blind eye. He'd seen it before, in the army camps, in the faces of men who ignored the cries of the broken because it was easier to stay silent. But Emma's whisper, "It hurts when I sit," wasn't something he could unhear. It clung to him, sharp and unyielding, like a splinter under the skin. Back at the chapel, Emma knelt by the steps, scrubbing with a brush that was more bristle than handle. Her hands were raw, the bandages on her knuckles stained pink from reopened cuts. The town moved around her, men hauling sacks of grain, women bartering eggs for thread. But no one stopped to offer water or ask why a young woman was scrubbing stone on her knees before noon. She kept her head down, her dark hair falling over her face like a curtain. Every few minutes she shifted her weight, wincing as her hips pressed against the hard ground. The pain was a constant now, a reminder of the nights in the Blake house, of Reverend Thomas Blake's hands in Margaret's sharp corrections. But worse than the pain was the silence, the way the town saw her bruises and looked away. Jacob stood across the street, his cart parked by the hitching post. He hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something pulled him here, the same instinct that made him check a horse's hoof for stones. He watched Emma, her movements slow but deliberate, like she was fighting a battle no one else could see. He wanted to walk over, to tell her she didn't have to stay, but her words from that morning stopped him. That's what they told the last girl. There was a story behind those words, one the town had buried, and Jacob knew pushing too hard might scare her off. So he waited, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes scanning the street for anyone who might notice him watching. Inside the chapel, Reverend Blake paced behind the pulpit, his leather-bound Bible open but unread. His sermon notes lay scattered, his usual calm replaced by a restless energy. He'd heard about Jacob's visit to the sheriff, the whispers already spreading like wildfire. "That blacksmith's meddling," he muttered, his fingers tightening on the Bible's edge. Thomas Blake was no stranger to whispers. He'd built Willow Creek's faith on his own terms, turning a dusty outpost into a town that hung on his every word. But faith, he knew, was fragile. One crack, one doubt, and the whole thing could crumble. Emma was his ward, his charity case, and the town had no right to question how he raised her. She's ungrateful, he told himself, but the lie tasted bitter. Margaret Blake, meanwhile, stood in the kitchen, her hands wrist deep in dough. Her face was a mask, but her eyes darted to the window every time a shadow passed. She'd seen Jacob too, lingering like a storm cloud. He's trouble, she said to no one, her voice low. She didn't need to say more. She'd always known how to keep Emma in line. A ladle to the back, salt in her cuts, words that cut deeper than either. But now, with Jacob watching, she felt something new. Not fear, not yet, but a prickle of unease. She kneaded the dough harder, her knuckles whitening. Emma felt it too, that shift in the air. She'd seen Jacob by the cart, his presence both a comfort and a danger. She wanted to trust him, to believe someone could care without wanting something in return. But trust was a luxury she'd long since lost. The last girl, her name was Leela, had trusted a deacon who promised to help. Leela was gone now, sent away to a sanatorium, or so the Blakes said. Emma had found her old shawl in the attic, torn and stained, and no one in town ever spoke her name. That's what happened when you spoke up in Willow Creek. You disappeared, one way or another. That afternoon, Jacob made another move. He walked to the saloon, where the men gathered after work, their voices loud with whiskey and complaints. He didn't drink, didn't sit, just stood by the door and listened. The talk was predictable. Crops, weather, the price of feed. But then someone mentioned Emma. Saw her scrubbing again, one man said, shaking his head. Poor thing's always working. Another laughed. Maybe if she smiled more, the Reverend wouldn't be so hard on her. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to gauge how deep the town's loyalty to Blake ran. Too deep. He realized as the men changed the subject, their laughter drowning out the truth. Back at the Blake house, Emma stood at the kitchen window, her hands pressed to the frame. She'd seen Jacob head toward the saloon, his stride purposeful. She didn't know what he was planning, but it stirred something in her. A flicker of hope, fragile as a candle in the wind. She turned back to the dishes, her movements mechanical. Margaret was upstairs, her footsteps creaking overhead. The Reverend was out, visiting a sick parishioner, or so he claimed. Emma knew better. His late-night absences always left the house quieter, but not safer. She washed a plate, then another, her mind racing. What if Jacob was right? What if she didn't have to stay quiet? But the thought was cut short by Margaret's voice from the stairs. Stop dawdling, girl. You've got floors to mop. That night, the town settled into its usual rhythm. Lamps flickering out, dogs barking in the distance. Jacob sat by his forge, the fire low but steady. He wasn't working, just staring into the flames, the way he did when he needed to think. He'd tried the sheriff, tried listening to the town, but nothing had changed. Emma was still trapped, still hurting, and the town was still blind. He thought of Sarah, how he'd failed to save her, how her fever had come so fast he couldn't even say goodbye. He wouldn't fail Emma. Not if he could help it. Emma, in her attic room, lay awake, her blanket pulled tight. The house was silent, but her mind was loud. She kept replaying Jacob's words. You don't have to stay quiet. They were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. She turned onto her side, wincing as her hips pressed into the cot. The pain was worse tonight, the bruises deeper. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine a world where she could speak and be heard. But all she saw was Leela's shawl, forgotten in the attic. All she heard was the town's silence, thick and suffocating. She whispered into the dark, I don't know how to be brave. But the words felt like a start, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built to survive. Outside, the wind swept through Willow Creek, carrying dust and secrets. The town slept, unaware that the quiet they cherished was about to break. Emma's hands shook as she tied the twine around the small wooden box, her fingers clumsy in the dim light of the attic. The house was still, the kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath. Reverend Blake was gone, off on one of his late night council calls, his boots leaving a trail of rose-scented lies. Margaret's snores drifted from the parlor, heavy and uneven, the whiskey glass at her feet glinting in the moonlight. Emma moved carefully, her bare feet silent on the creaking floorboards. Every ache in her body screamed, but she pushed it down, her mind fixed on the box. Inside was everything she owned. A worn Bible, a creased photo of her parents, a tin of salve for her bruises, a scarf, a few coins, and a hairbrush with missing bristles. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and tonight it was her anchor. She'd lain awake for hours, Jacob's words circling in her head. You don't have to stay quiet. They were a spark, small but fierce, and they'd ignited something she hadn't felt in years. Courage, not the loud, reckless kind, but the quiet sort that made her heart pound and her knees weak. She didn't know if she could trust Jacob, didn't know if he'd be there when she needed him. But she knew she couldn't stay in this house another night. Not with the Reverend's shadow looming, not with Margaret's hands always ready to strike. She thought of Leela, the girl before her, whose shawl still haunted the attic. Emma wouldn't be another forgotten name. She crept downstairs, the box clutched to her chest. At the back door, she paused, her breath shallow. The note she'd written was tucked under the twine, its words simple but heavy. If something happens to me, give this to the man who saw me. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. She set the box on the threshold, the note fluttering in the breeze, and slipped into the night. The air was cool, the stars hidden behind clouds that rolled like secrets across the sky. Emma walked fast, her dress catching on thorns as she cut through the scrubland toward Jacob's cabin. Her heart raced, not from fear of being caught, but from the weight of what she was doing. Leaving wasn't just running, it was choosing herself. Miles away, Jacob sat by his forge, the fire reduced to embers. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His hands, rough from years of iron and ash, polished a knife he hadn't touched in a decade. The blade caught the light, sharp and unyielding, like the thoughts that kept him awake. He'd tried the sheriff, tried the town, but Willow Creek was built on silence, and silence was a wall he couldn't break alone. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, her tiny hand in his, her laughter like a song he'd never hear again. He'd failed her, failed his wife, but Emma was different. She was still here, still fighting, even if she didn't know it. He wouldn't let her disappear. The knock came softly, 2 hesitant taps. Jacob opened the door, and there she was, Emma, soaked from the mist. Her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn at the hem. Her eyes weren't crying, but they held a rawness that made his chest tighten. I'm sorry, she whispered. He stepped aside, letting her in without a word. Inside, he draped a wool blanket over her shoulders and set a basin of warm water by the fire. She didn't flinch when he checked her wrists, didn't pull away when he handed her a tin mug of broth. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The fire crackled, its light dancing across her face, and for the first time, Jacob saw something beyond pain in her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but a stubborn will to keep going. I left everything, she said finally, her voice low but steady. Good, Jacob replied. She looked at him, her brows knitting. That's all you'll say. He met her gaze, his eyes calm but firm. Sometimes leaving is louder than shouting. Emma's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She leaned back in the chair, her body relaxing for the first time in years. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was shelter, a place where she didn't have to explain or hide. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest, her breathing soft against the crackle of the fire. Dawn broke over Willow Creek, the sky a pale gray that promised rain. Reverend Blake stood at his doorstep, his long coat buttoned tight, staring at the box Emma had left behind. The note fluttered under the twine, its words like a blade to his composure. Margaret appeared behind him, her hair pinned severely. She's gone, she said, her voice flat. Blake didn't answer, just picked up the box and turned toward the road. You think it was that blacksmith? Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing. Blake's jaw tightened. It's time the town remembers who holds this flock together. His tone was too calm, too controlled. Margaret stepped closer. You'll make a sermon of it. No, he said, his voice like stone. I'll make an example. Across town, Jacob hitched his mule to the cart, his movements steady but quick. Emma stood by the barn, her arms crossed, the blanket still draped over her shoulders. You're leaving, she said, her voice tight. We're leaving, he corrected. I don't want to run, she said, her chin lifting. Not running, Jacob said. Moving forward. She hesitated, then climbed onto the cart beside him. As they rolled out of town, Jacob handed her a scrap of paper, a rough map sketched in charcoal. It marked a trail to Pine Hollow, a quiet valley where old army friends of his lived. Safe house, she asked, her voice soft. Just space, he said, no one asks questions there. She folded the map and tucked it into her dress, her fingers lingering on the paper. Back in Willow Creek, Sheriff Holt paced his office, his boots scuffing the floor. Word of Emma's disappearance had spread, and with it, whispers about Jacob Kane. The town was restless, their loyalty to Blake fraying at the edges. Holt mounted his horse and rode toward the chapel, but his mind wasn't on the Reverend. He was thinking of a letter he'd found at the telegraph office, one sent from a sanatorium in Santa Fe. It was from a girl named Leela, who'd worked for the Blakes years ago. Her words were brief but chilling. "If someone still listens, I was not the first." Holt tucked the letter into his coat, his jaw tight. He didn't know what he'd do with it, but he knew Emma wasn't coming back to that house. As Jacob's cart creaked along the dusty trail, Emma sat silent, the box in her lap. She'd gone back for it at dawn, slipping into town before the Blakes woke. She couldn't leave it behind, not with Leela's shawl tucked inside, a reminder of what happened to girls who stayed quiet. The letter from Leela, found in the attic months ago, was there too, its words burned into her memory. She hadn't shown it to Jacob yet, but she would. For now, she let the rhythm of the cart in the open sky hold her, the weight of her choice settling into something solid. She wasn't running, she was free. The dust of Pine Hollow still clung to Emma's dress as she stepped back into Willow Creek, her chin high, her hands trembling around the folded letter. The town felt different now, its streets too quiet, like a held breath before a storm. She walked beside Sheriff Holt, his boots steady on the boardwalk, his face set with a resolve she hadn't seen before. The letter from Leela, the girl who'd come before her, burned in her grip, a single page that held the weight of years of silence. Emma wasn't here to beg or hide. She was here to speak, to let the truth crack open the town's carefully guarded peace. Jacob had stayed behind at her request, his cart parked under the cottonwoods at Pine Hollow. This wasn't his fight, she'd told him. It was hers. The chapel loomed ahead, its whitewashed walls glowing in the noon sun. Reverend Blake stood on the steps, his coat pressed, his collar stiff, as if he'd been waiting for her. His eyes narrowed when he saw Holt, then Emma, her posture unyielding despite the bruises that still ached beneath her dress. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. Holt didn't answer, just pushed open the chapel doors. "We're holding testimony," he said, "right here, right now." The words landed like a hammer on iron, and Blake's face faltered, just for a moment. Word spread fast in Willow Creek, faster than the wind through the gullies. By the time Emma stepped inside, the pews were filling. Farmers in worn overalls, women with babies on their hips, elders who hadn't missed a Sunday in decades. They came curious, skeptical, some already whispering about the girl who'd run off with the blacksmith. Emma walked to the pulpit, her footsteps echoing in the hushed chapel. She didn't rush, didn't falter, though her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break free. She unfolded Lila's letter and held it up, its creases worn from her touch. "This is from a girl who lived in the Reverend's house before me," she said, her voice clear, steady, louder than she'd ever spoken in this town. She read aloud, each word a stone dropped into still water. "He prayed with us at night, then came into our rooms when his wife was asleep. He said it was God's way of testing our purity." Gasps rippled through the pews, soft at first, then louder like a wave breaking. Emma lowered the letter, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Sister Ellen, who'd laughed off her pain, Clara, the widow who'd always looked away, even Margaret Blake, standing rigid in the back, her face pale as ash. "I said it hurt to sit," Emma continued, her voice softer now, but no less fierce. "I told you, and you all looked away." The truth hung there, heavy, undeniable. She didn't shout, didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her words were enough, each one carving a space where silence had ruled for too long. Reverend Blake stepped forward, his face flushed, his hands raised like a man warding off a blow. "This is blasphemy," he shouted. "I've served this town, baptized your children, buried your kin!" The sheriff moved in front of him, his hand resting on his holster. "Sit down, Thomas." Blake froze, his eyes darting to the crowd, searching for allies. But the faces looking back weren't the same ones he'd preached to for 20 years. Doubt had crept in, splintering the faith he'd built. Margaret Blake stood motionless, her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles whitened. A single tear slid down her cheek, not for her husband, but for the life she'd built on his lies. Emma met her gaze not with anger, but with something closer to pity. She turned back to the congregation, her hands steady now. "I'm not here to burn this place down," she said. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm asking something harder. I'm asking you not to forget. Not me, not Leela, not the next girl." She paused, letting the words settle. "Because there will be a next girl, if you let there be." The silence that followed was louder than any sermon. Then, one by one, a few women stood. Sister Ellen, her hands trembling. Clara, her eyes wet. Even Margaret, her shoulders slumping as she rose. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their standing was enough. Outside, the town felt the shift, though no one could name it yet. The air was thick, the sky heavy with clouds that hadn't broken. Emma stepped down from the pulpit, the letter still in her hand. She didn't look at Blake. Didn't need to see his face to know he was unraveling. Holt nodded to her, a small gesture, but it carried weight. "You did good," he said, his voice low. She didn't answer, just walked toward the doors, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. The crowd parted for her, some reaching out, others turning away, unable to meet her eyes. She didn't care. She'd said what she came to say, and the truth was out, alive, impossible to bury again. As she stepped into the sunlight, the chapel bell rang, not by Blake's hand, but by Clara's, who'd slipped into the bell tower without a word. The sound rolled over Willow Creek, clear and sharp, not calling for prayer, but for something deeper. Truth. Emma paused on the steps, letting the sound wash over her. She thought of Lilla, of the shawl in her box, of the nights she'd spent curled against the attic wall, afraid to hope. She thought of Jacob, waiting at Pine Hollow, his quiet strength a tether she hadn't known she needed. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just stood there, breathing, feeling the weight of her own voice for the first time. Inside, Blake sank into a pew, his hands covering his face. The congregation murmured, some leaving, others staying, their voices a mix of shock and shame. Margaret slipped out the back, her footsteps quick, as if she could outrun what she'd seen. The town would talk for weeks, maybe years, about this day, about the girl who spoke, the reverend who fell, the silence that broke. But Emma didn't care about their whispers. She'd given them the truth, and what they did with it was theirs to carry. She walked back toward the edge of town, the letter tucked into her dress. Holt followed at a distance, his horse's reins loose in his hand. "You going back to Kane's?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emma nodded. "For now," she said. He didn't press, just tipped his hat and turned away. The road to Pine Hollow stretched ahead, dusty and long, but Emma didn't feel its weight. She felt something else, something new. Not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it, like a seed buried in good soil, waiting for rain. The road to Pine Hollow wound through brittle cottonwoods and dry gullies, carrying Emma and Jacob away from Willow Creek's heavy air. The cart creaked under their weight, its wheels kicking up dust that settled like a memory they were ready to leave behind. Emma sat with her hands folded around the wooden box, Leela's letter tucked safely inside. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between her and Jacob was different now. Comfortable, like the quiet of a house after a storm has passed. The valley opened before them, a stretch of sandstone and sagebrush where an old homestead stood, half rotted but sturdy enough to call home. It wasn't much. A sagging frame house, a trickling spring, a barn leaning slightly to the left. But it was theirs, a place where no one asked for obedience or silence. Jacob unhitched the mule and carried their supplies inside, his movements steady, unhurried. Emma explored the property, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. She ran her fingers along the weathered fence, testing its strength. "I could fix the shutters," she said, glancing back at him. Jacob nodded, setting down a sack of flour. "We'll need them before the rains." "Rains don't come till July," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He looked at her then, his eyes soft but serious. "Planning to stay that long?" She didn't answer, just turned toward the house, her smile saying more than words could. For the first time, Emma felt like she was building something, not just surviving it. Back in Willow Creek, the chapel stood quieter than it had in decades. Reverend Blake had vanished by week's end, leaving only a curt note on his desk. "Gone to seek God's guidance." No one believed it, but no one dared say so. Margaret packed her bags and left for her sisters in Albuquerque, her face hidden behind a black veil, her silence louder than any sermon. The pew sat emptier now, the hymns softer, as if the town was afraid to sing too loudly. Sister Ellen took up the altar work, sweeping the steps Emma had once scrubbed on bleeding knees. She didn't preach, didn't pray out loud, but her presence was a quiet apology, a promise to do better. The town felt it, the shift, though they didn't speak it. Something had broken, and something new was taking its place. Emma and Jacob worked side by side at Pine Hollow, their days filled with small, deliberate acts. He hammered new beams into the house, his forge glowing again with purpose. She laid foundation stones, her hands steady despite the scars. In the evenings, they sat by the spring, sharing coffee that was too bitter but warm enough to comfort. Jacob didn't ask about the chapel, didn't press her to talk about Blake or Leela. He knew she'd speak when she was ready. One night, as the stars blinked through the cottonwoods, she did. "I kept Leela's shawl because I thought I'd need proof," she said, her voice low. Proof I wasn't crazy. Jacob stirred the fire, his eyes on the flames. You didn't need proof. You needed someone to listen. She looked at him, her throat tight. You did. He nodded just once, and that was enough. Emma planted herbs behind the house. Sage, thyme, a few sprigs of lavender she traded for in town. She patched her dresses with scraps of blue linen, each stitch a reclaiming of herself. On market days, she rode into Willow Creek on a borrowed mare, her basket heavy with hand-stitched goods. She didn't look at the chapel, didn't need to. The town saw her now, not as the Reverend's ward, but as Emma, the woman who'd spoken and survived. Women like Clara stopped to buy her embroidery, their conversations brief but kind. Men tipped their hats, their eyes carrying a mix of respect and shame. Emma didn't linger, but she didn't hide either. She was done being a ghost. Jacob offered her the cabin outright, even cleared the loft where his old army gear gathered dust. Stay as long as you want, he said, his voice rough but sincere. Emma shook her head. I'm not ready to rest yet. I want to build something, not just live in someone else's. He understood, maybe better than anyone, so they kept working, turning the homestead into a place that held them both without asking for more than they could give. Emma learned to swing a hammer, her hands growing stronger, her laughter coming easier. Jacob started talking more. Not much, but enough to share stories of his daughter, Sarah, and the wildflowers she loved. Each word was a bridge, small but solid, between their pasts and this new life. One afternoon, Sheriff Holt rode up to Pine Hollow, his hat dusty from the trail. He dismounted slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no trouble. Just checking in, he said, his eyes scanning the homestead. Emma stepped onto the porch, her apron dusted with flour. We're fine, she said, her voice calm but firm. Holt nodded, then pulled a small envelope from his coat. Found another letter from Leela, he said. She's doing better. Wanted you to know. Emma took the envelope, her fingers lingering on the paper. Thank you, she said. Holt tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a quiet pride in his wake. Emma didn't open the letter right away. She tucked it into her box, next to the first one, a reminder that some truths, once spoken, could heal. By summer, Willow Creek's annual fair brought the town together, as it always had. Children ran through the square, tugging at corncakes, while fiddlers played waltzes under the oak trees. Emma arrived in her wagon, her dress clean, her face calm. She set up a stall next to Jacob's, her hand-stitched goods laid out beside his horseshoes. The townsfolk noticed, their whispers softer now, tinged with curiosity instead of judgment. A few women bought her work, their fingers lingering on the careful stitches. A man offered Jacob a cigar, a small gesture of respect. Emma didn't seek their approval, didn't need it. She was there for herself, for the life she was building, one stitch, one stone, one day at a time. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of copper, Emma stood by the stall, watching the crowd. Jacob joined her, his hands in his pockets. You did good today? He said. She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. We both did. The fair carried on, its music and laughter a reminder that life kept moving, even after the hardest truths. Emma felt it, the possibility of joy. Not loud or sudden, but steady, like the spring that fed their homestead. She wasn't whole yet, but she was healing, and that was enough. The dust of Willow Creek settled, but its story lingered, a quiet testament to what happens when one voice refuses to stay silent. Emma's truth had cracked open a town, not with fire or vengeance, but with the steady weight of honesty. She and Jacob built more than a homestead in Pine Hollow. They built a life, one where pain was acknowledged, not hidden, where scars were proof of survival, not shame. The town learned to listen, to stand, to remember, and in that listening, they found a way forward. Some truths are heavy, but they're also light, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Emma carried hers every day, in the herbs she planted, the stitches she sewed, the laughter she shared with Jacob by the fire. And somewhere, in the soft rustle of cottonwoods, Leela's spirit rested, knowing her words had mattered. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Some truths deserve to be told, and some voices deserve to be heard.